Thank you, Margaret, for that summary, and welcome everyone. A very warm welcome to those of you who joined yesterday and a warm welcome to those of you joining today. We see this as our reunion, and I think Margaret made that point, but we're really happy at the end of our first phase to get together, share experiences, reflect what we've done over the past 5 years, and also reflect with our participants and the work they've been doing. So it's been very rewarding and interesting, and I thank you all for joining and contributing. I'm going to give a brief overview of the GREAT project for those of you who may not be that familiar with it or who may be joining us for the first time. For those of you who know about GREAT, this may be a little repetitive. So really, GREAT is a story. It's a great story. In 2015, when I ran into Vicky at a World Food Prize event and I asked her, does award convene trainings, or do you know anyone who convenes training for breeding teams on applied gender training? And at that time, there were no trainings to be found, or there were few, or they were very internal. They were hard to get access to. But in 2020, in those 5 years, we've actually reached 260 participants from 51 institutions in 26 countries. So it's really turned around in a short period of time, and we're really proud of this achievement. And the demand for GREAT is really overwhelming. Next slide, please. So why do we need GREAT? I think for this audience who are joining today, that's pretty obvious. I don't need to say it, but it bears repeating, and we can't say it enough. Really, gender determines what a farmer has a right to access and benefit from in all forms of interacting with agricultural-based livelihoods: land, labor, inputs, information, credit, all of it. So we know that for gender and agriculture research for development, we have to be very responsive and sensitive and cognizant of gender issues. And the two different arguments, of course, of the effectiveness argument in terms of gender responsive interventions are just more adopted and effective. And also the social justice argument that it's the right thing to do to turn over the historical social inequalities to achieve equivalent life outcomes. Next, please. So we have a focus right now with GREAT on crop improvement and plant breeding. So a lot of times when the Ag Research for Development, that broader look at why gender issues are important therein, the question comes to, well, what does this have to do with plant breeding? Next slide, please. So at GREAT and beyond that, in a community of researchers pushing for this change in crop improvement, we believe that plant breeding should be more about people than plants. So we know that officially, when you look at crop improvement programs, and reviews show this, that objectives and breeding program direction and priorities are really still set within small groups of expert input. And there's a tension between kind of modeling the geography of where the plants will be grown with the demography or the social context where they'll be grown, and how that reflects on every stage of the breeding program. And also we know, for example, we do a lot of the GREAT fellows have done trait-based work looking at gender differences in trait preferences, and those really are known to be following gender divisions of labor and market access. And it's also a question of power and control. So how are decisions made within breeding programs and breeding systems is still very much with a small group of individuals and not with a lot of feedback loops from communities, especially women smallholders. So at the end of the day, we're really looking to not just focus on genetic gains, but looking at equity gains and how those go together and not mutually exclusive. Next slide, please. So how does GREAT fit into this picture? What do we do towards this vision? Next slide, please. This is a kind of a breeding cycle from the Gender Breeding Initiative, and I'm just putting it up here to show that for those of you who think gender issues in plant breeding are restricted to trait-based studies or very fixed intervention points, this kind of widens it out to say every step along a breeding cycle can have gender responsive decision and result points. So it's really important to systematically think of gender issues within the whole breeding cycle. And where GREAT fits in is really a lot of this work, even if you look at this bottom end here, looking at delivery strategies for seeds or trait-based studies or looking at social targeting, these are not things that breeders can do alone. And it requires agronomists, pathologists, breeders working with social scientists, gender experts, economists, anthropologists, rural sociologists to bring all of those streams of work together, that it's not something we can do alone. So GREAT really has that at the heart of everything we do, and that kind of fundamental principle of interdisciplinarity and co-design and development and delivery is really helping to fulfill this vision of how we have integration of gender issues across the whole breeding cycle. Next slide, please. So what do we do differently? There are a lot of training programs out there and not many focused on crop improvement, but we have some general principles I'll just like to go over. So these are central tenets to the GREAT model, quote unquote, and really what drives us is to move from rhetoric to action. So how do we go to actually changing breeding practice specifically? So everything we do is practice oriented. So all of the principles that we introduce are substantive in terms of the theoretical underpinnings, but are highly applied. So every step of the way as we introduce new concepts, we make sure that that's coupled with application. The second is that we question assumptions all along the journey together with GREAT. So we focus a lot on self-realization, but also evidence-based decision-making. We take a lot of time to review how are decisions made. If we make assumptions on what's important for who and why, that we're making sure to unpack those and base those decisions on evidence rather than assumptions. We also reconceptualize breeding processes to say that not starting from varieties and traits, but we start with end users. And this is in line with changes that are happening across the breeding ecosystem globally, that the shift towards consumers or end users or producers and how that knowledge and methods to understand those nuances and respond specifically to the needs of women and girls. And redefining breeding teams. In all of our work, we have this instilling of the value of interdisciplinarity. So we think the most effective and impactful breeding can only be done through interdisciplinary teams of breeders and social scientists that not only implementing, but also designing together. The last two are really focusing on methods, or the penultimate one is focusing on methods. So we spend a lot of time on, I would say, basic social science research methods, qualitative and quantitative. And the reason we do that in this interdisciplinary audience is to really demonstrate the science, quote unquote, of social science. And that may be obvious to the social scientists amongst you, but we think it's really important for interdisciplinary teams to understand one another and see the rigor of the social science method, especially the qualitative methods, and how difficult and rigorous and really important they are, and how they can enrich the breeding process, and how mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative social science mixed methods, help to make the breeding process better. So instead of thinking breeding methods focused on the biophysical breeding methods, we open that up to include the social science methods that help define breeding. And we really have a focus, lastly, on the transformational change. So we really want to intentionally increase opportunities and sharing of benefits for smallholder women farmers. So that is really baked into starting from the design phase all the way out to the implementation. And hopefully over time, through partnerships and through systems level changes, gender responsiveness becomes the norm and standard. It's no longer an exception or an add-in, but it's central to everything that's done. And I think that's happening, especially with the gender platform now. Next, please. So these are just brief slides to demonstrate what I mean. They're interesting points. We call them aha moments within the course, where you sometimes shake the foundation of someone's, the way they look at their research. And statements like, I'm worried. It looks like we're making a lot of wrong interventions and assumptions, to us is opening a door for change. So not just kind of questioning assumptions, but then saying, here's what you can do about now that you've learned that maybe something needs to change in your breeding work. Next, please. And another thing we see a lot throughout our course is this realization of the importance of interdisciplinarity. So understanding one another, valuing one another's work and the contributions to the overall goals is something that develops over the course and actually lasts after the course. Next slide, please. And one of the most, I think, interesting exercises is having these hands-on applied trials of social science research methods for the biophysical scientists, not with the understanding or assumptions that the breeders will become social scientists, but just have that experiential learning. And we see this a lot, that during those experiential learning sessions, a lot of time the biophysical scientists, the breeders, agronomists, pathologists, will say, this was very difficult. I had no idea this was so difficult. And as I was trying to have these interviews or focus groups, I got off track and I didn't get the information that I needed. So that's really important, enlightening moment during the course as well. Next slide, please. So brief results and impact of what we've achieved over the last 5 years. So this is a culmination of 5 years of data. Our MEL partner is Align, and they graciously every year send us a report, but also do our outcome surveys. And they've done a lot of work with case studies I'll come to a little bit later. But this just shows that over the outcome monitoring report, before and after GREAT, the level of application of gender responsive research methods. So you really should see this dramatic shift from very low to low or moderate to really high to very high after the course. And this is self-reported in terms of the participants self-reporting their application of gender responsive research methods. Next slide, please. We also see that that is stable, mostly stable across cohorts. And this is application, this is a survey we do every year. So these are past cohorts and how they're continuing to apply gender responsive research. So 50% at least continue to apply their very high to high level of application, despite it being 4 or 5 years beyond. And there's some fluctuations in that. And this is where we have reflection points to think about, what did we do differently? Next, please. We also had 6 in-depth case studies that Align conducted, realizing that self-reported data on application is not always reliable, and we need to triangulate that with peers and also reviewing work that has been done. So they took a good amount of time to understand in 6 different cases and programs and teams how those teams had continued or not continued to apply what they've learned in GREAT. So what we see is for some of these, even 2 or 3 years down the line, there was a continued interest and enthusiasm for advancing gender responsive research across the board. So that was really exciting for us. The second exciting point that emerged from those in-depth case studies is that social scientists are reporting greater confidence and increased opportunities to carry out their work. And that is extremely important, because the more value is placed on the social scientists and the gender researchers in particular within breeding institutions, and creating space and opportunities for them to do gender-focused work can only positively impact those institutions. So that was really exciting. And the third point is that the team approach really catalyzed more interdisciplinarity and other research. So increased collaboration between not only the team members that joined together, that's scaling and rippling out to increase collaboration within the different disciplines for research proposals and implementations of projects. So that, again, was really exciting to see that in practice and years later, those changes were still in place. Here's some examples of, we also wanted to focus on how the practice of breeding had changed after GREAT, because that was really important to us to show impact. And we saw these top 2 really summarize, saying that on-farm testing and consumer evaluation and doing PVS, for example, participatory varietal selection, and in all of those cases, there was a greater focus on inclusion and looking at who was being selected, how and why. And considering the sex of the host farmers for trials, this is a quote from one of the case studies, and that deliberate intention to make sure that they were selecting fields belonging to women and men, and making sure that the diversity of communities they were working with were being reflected on with the respondents being chosen. We also saw that data collection and reporting was changing, that you had more sex disaggregation of data, and that was permeating through practice after the course. We saw that there was a deliberate approach to fostering interdisciplinary teams after the course again. And in one particular case, even changing conservation strategies from the breeding program was taking place due to the effects of the course. So these were really long-lasting, interesting, and kind of the first glimmers of change within these breeding programs. So where do we go next? I won't take a lot of time on this, but just to sensitize that we are now formally moving into our second phase as of April, and we'll be joining the gender platform that just got announced this year, and we'll be working very closely with them, which we're very, very excited about, to kind of expand our impact and work more closely with the CG gender researchers. And the vision that we have in our collaboration going forward with the platform is continuing to focus on our courses. So developing and delivering courses on selected gender responsive research methods and tools. Because what we see as a gap is this kind of deeper learning, especially for social scientists and gender researchers within breeding institutions, on learning how to adapt methods and tools to get the information that they need to guide breeding programs. And once we kind of have that basic training, both for interdisciplinary teams, but also deeper training for social scientists and gender experts, that we would then test, modify, and provide feedback on some of the selected gender tools, models, or case studies, so that the people developing those methods and tools got live feedback, especially from national programs, where we would emphasize application and practicability over academic review. We also plan NARI CG reciprocal exchanges, so two-way exchanges to build relationships, share knowledge, capacity development opportunities, and form small group research clusters. So that's, again, something really exciting that we're looking forward to. And lastly, we want to kind of adapt our training material. We realize that we have shortcomings in seed systems and climate resilience, for example, or we need to adapt our training material for South Asia. So we'll be doing all of that in the second phase, but also thinking about how do we bring this material back to graduate program training, both at Makerere and Cornell, so adaptation there too. So with that, I'll close my presentation, and this is just to set the scene for the rest of the day for those of you joining who may not know about GREAT, to set the scene for us. But really, the most exciting part of today are the presentations. So I'm going to hand over to Brenda to start us off with our first group of presentations. Thank you.